As you've just heard, Stephen Flynn is currently the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of a book called America the Vulnerable, recently published by HarperCollins, and he makes the argument in the book that we have not provided the protection for terrorism as we thought that perhaps the public had thought that the government had. And so, fascinating read. Dr. Flynn recently served as director and principal author for the task force report titled America Still Unprepared, Still in Danger. It was co-chaired by former Senators Warren Redmond and Gary Hart. He is one of the best experts on Homeland Security and is widely regarded as someone who is an innovative thinker and intellectual leader on this issue. He is the intellectual architect of a port security initiative that the U.S. government is undertaking. He's also the founder of a partnership, a private-public partnership on global container security. He has served as the principal advisor to the bipartisan Congressional Port Security Caucus. He's a member of the Marine Board of the National Research Council. He served in the White House Military Office under the George H.W. Bush administration and as Director for Global Issues on the National Security Council staff in the Clinton administration. He's a retired U.S. Coast Guard commander. He served for 20 years in the Coast Guard on active duty, and during that time was a commander of 2 Coast Guard cutters. He has a PhD in international politics from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's a native of Salem, Massachusetts, but now lives in a quaint, pretty little town in Connecticut called Old Lyme with his wife and his daughter. I have known Professor Flynn since our days together as colleagues at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. We had offices right across from each other, and I could overhear his many conversations and got a sense at the time that this was a rising star. And indeed, that is what has happened. He was then as dynamic and gregarious and engaging and warm as he is now, and it's just a pleasure to have him come and talk to you. And so I introduce Professor Flynn.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Richard, for having me. We've been talking about this for years, trying to get out here and the mutual affection for one another here and respect. So the early stage of my career as a lieutenant, just getting into the academic business here, and Richard was really a role model for me on the scholarship side. And we both, any military, any university, as its insanity, ratchet that up quite a few notches, and you get what a military academy is like. And so having a kindred spirit is a very helpful thing, and look back on those days very, very fondly. I'm honored to be here as a part of this program and have the chance to talk with you about a very serious issue that I would argue that we didn't talk about in the course of this last election. The stuff that I'm going to be talking about here today, I'd argue, despite that we had an election supposedly grounded in the war on terror, we didn't talk about the core reality of 9/11, that the terrorists were here. They didn't import a weapon of mass destruction. They converted something we depend upon in our day-to-day lives, airplanes, and turned them into one. And that most of the costs that accrued from that dreadful day, beyond the horrific loss of life, were things we did to ourselves because we were spooked. That was a new security paradigm, in my view, that we should be approaching with some vigor. How do we adapt to it? Well, we haven't. Instead, what I would argue, we're going through a version that I put in my 3rd chapter I call the Phoney War. Now, I use that term not just to get your attention, but I'm borrowing from history. The Phoney War was the period between September 1939 and May 1940, when in September 1939, the Germans practiced a new form of warfare called blitzkrieg, taking their essentially offensive capability, running it way ahead of the logistics supply chain, and rolling across the Polish border and decimating the Polish army within a matter of days. It was a new way of doing war. It also was a period where the British and French abandoned the policy of appeasement and finally declared war on Germany. They recalled their ambassadors. They mobilized the reserves. They counted up the number of planes they had, the number of troops they had, the number of ships they had, and they were convinced that the Germans would not mess with them. And what they did is they replayed World War I over again. Since the trench this time was a line called the Maginot Line, which they fortified. And for the next few months, these nations that were at war didn't have much of a war. If you were in Paris in April 1940, it wasn't a whole lot different being in Paris in April 1939, except that there were a lot more people running around with uniforms. The conviction was that there was deterrence by mobilizing on the Maginot Line, and the Germans would step back. What did not happen during that critical period was that the German and French high commands did not adapt themselves to blitzkrieg as a new form of warfare that would be used against them. And they paid a terrible price for that in May 1940 when the panzer divisions came down through the lowlands, around the line, and into Paris, which fell almost immediately. And thank God for a good day on the Channel. The British, who were pushed back to Dunkirk, were able to get off with literally the shirts on their back, leaving most of the equipment behind. The new warfare that we saw on September 11th, and I argue, is how war will be conducted against the United States and advanced societies in the 21st century, is the use of catastrophic terror directed at the non-military elements of our power. The civil society and the critical infrastructure that underpins our way of life is how warfare will be fought in the 21st century. That's what was played out as a prelude on September 11th. But we're not adapting that way. What we're doing is essentially taking the old paradigm of national security as essentially the use of force directed at states who would pose a threat, in this case through a conduit, terrorism, that we need to sort of go after. And rather than rethinking how national security should be redefined in the context of this new threat, we created a new term for this new threat, which we called Homeland Security. I remember sort of watching the speech when the President did on September 20th, 2001, before the joint members of Congress, where he announced that the then governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, would be the new guy taking care of Homeland Security. You could almost see the collective sigh of relief on the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in the State Department and the intelligence say, we don't have to do this new stuff. That's now Homeland Security. What I really see here is the breakdown on this is a couple of problems. The basic characterization that the Bush administration took at the outset was that essentially the war on terror would not do well without state sponsorship. So the first thing is you eliminate the Taliban regime. That seemed pretty straightforward. The second would be to go after Iraq, because Saddam seemed to be somebody who would be up to this kind of game, and he was certainly an unsavory character. But the notion was almost of deterrence based, that if we in fact sent signals using this overwhelming military power to states who would harbor or support terrorists, that that would be a way in which we could nip this thing in its bud. There is a disconnect here, I think, between the reality of the threat. State sponsorship helps, but it's not necessarily sufficient for this threat to play itself out. And particularly in the case of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda was as much a sponsor for the Taliban than the reverse. It was the fact that Afghanistan was a failing state where there was the ultimate petri dish of weapons left over from the war with the Mujahideen and the Soviet Union, where you had the number one commodity being opium, which is the precursor for heroin, where you had essentially the ability for a border that nobody could control that made that a great base of operations. The fact that the central government in Kabul was sympathetic to the views here was a nice bonus, but it was not a necessary variable. The fact is, for folks like me who have been looking at this problem for many, many years, I would make the case that it's quite that non-state actors can operate in lots of places part of the planet, have access to means of destruction that you don't have to be a state to acquire, and can direct them globally. And that's the new problem set, that the line between domestic and international essentially doesn't work very more, and the line between state-centric views of how one manages security needs to give way to one that looks at this new actor and how one figures out to affect that incentive structure. That's on the area of the threat and the characters that are involved with here. There's not, though, that we have to get at with the target, which is this critical infrastructure. Part of the reason why I would make the case that catastrophic terrorism will be the weapon of choice, the form of warfare in the 21st century, is built on two legs. The first is the lack of alternatives. The United States will spend more this year on conventional military capability, our Army, our Air Force, our naval forces, our space-based assets, than the next 30 nations combined. And by 2008, because there's not a whole lot left over, we'll be spending more than the entire world combined on conventional military power. There's never been a point in human history where as much military power has been concentrated in a single power as what the United States possesses today. To put it in historic context, the British at the height of their game, when the sun never set on the empire, their goal was 2 capital ships for every one that a great power competitor could muster. As a student of warfare, given that we have such overwhelming dominance in the conventional military realm, it suggests to me that war can only play out in 2 ways. First, we'll have very dumb adversaries who will take the stuff on. The second is that the adversary will adapt and find a weakness to which it will direct its attention to exploit. I would argue that it turns out there also is that opportunity, because unique in human history is this great power, this overwhelming dominant military power, is dependent upon global networks that exist largely outside of its territory. These are the networks of transportation, logistics, of energy, of finance, of information, of intellectual capital, of labor, that are global. Unlike the Roman Empire that kept marching out and controlling the economic space over which it dominated, the United States is dependent upon, for the prosperity that bankrolls its military power, that provides our way of life, supports our way of life, on these networks operating at a full belt. But it turns out that these networks aren't secure. Why is that the case? I would argue that acceleratively over the last 20 years, under this umbrella term that we're calling globalization, that we had 4 market imperatives that were operating at cascading speeds in the design and operation of these networks. The 4 were, first, how do we make the network as open as possible? How do we make it as efficient as possible? How do we make it as reliable as possible? And how do we make its use as low cost as possible? And the cascading effect with the lower the cost, the more people could afford to use the network. The more people were using the network, the greater pressure to make it efficient and reliable. The more you could depend upon it, the more people wanted to use it. Sound internet-like? The problem here is security was viewed as raising costs, undermining efficiency, undermining reliability, and putting pressure to close the system. I used to describe my life pre-9/11, dealing with the area of security in the global transportation logistics system, as like being a teetotaler at a New Year's Eve party. Who let this guy in here? Just when we were drumming out all the costs in the system, somebody comes in and mentions the fact that we might have to put some safeguards in place. Now, I was pointing some very inconvenient facts out, like the multi-ton shipments of illegal narcotics were moving in containers. That migrants, some dying en route, were habitating these containers to get from A to B. That every export control we ever dreamed up was being violated by people moving stuff in these containers. That crime pilferage was going from about $1 billion a year in 1990 to about $15 billion in 2000. As people figured out, this is a great bank to rob. No adult supervision here at all. And I'm suggesting the thing is a little insecure. And the response I got from people in this community was a bit like major retailers viewing shoplifting. It's a cost of doing business issue. You basically say that about 15% losses you're going to have to incur because people are going to walk out of the store without paying for it. And you do a few token things, like get a rather overfed security guy in the front, maybe a couple of cameras up here, but you never invite those security guys in the boardroom. My God, they'll scare all the customers away. You focus on the business side of things, and you do some stuff to create some level of tolerance for this here and build it in. So the response I would get is, yes, this is terrible, these drugs coming into our country. Oh, it's awful that we have migrants who are dying, and terrible that we can't enforce export controls, and that people are robbing the system blind. But come on, the wealth generation is coming from this system. Why would we want to really mess with it? Now I'm an adversary of the United States. I can't take you on frontally, but it turns out you've got this huge network that you're dependent upon that I can exploit or target. I don't care if it's al-Qaeda. I'm just saying current and future folks are going to figure this out. It's not rocket science. You get a big bang for your buck by exploiting and targeting networks that aren't secure. So one would suggest that we'd be thinking, working overtime since 9/11. We're a nation at war, recall? We reminded you of this about the election, that we'd be working full-time to address how we could secure that which is valuable and vulnerable to our way of life. But that's not happening. The United States will spend this year $500 billion. The President has asked in his 2006 budget for $419 billion for the Department of Defense and $81.9 billion supplemental for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. $500 billion. He also this year asked for the protection of the critical infrastructure that underpins our society, the pipelines, the roads, the bridges, the tunnels, the chemical facilities, the food supply systems, the ports. He asked for $600 million for all of it. That's what we spent every 3 days in the war in Iraq. Every 3 days in the war in Iraq, we're spending the same as what we're investing at the federal level to protect the critical infrastructure that underpins our way of life. One would suggest that we're not adapting to the new warfare. The total amount of new money for Homeland Security comes in at about $20 billion. That's a nickel on every dollar. Is that the prudent amount? Are we debating that amount? We're not debating that amount, national security versus Homeland Security. We're debating is the amount of Homeland Security money vis-a-vis other domestic priorities. But the national security budget, the national security strategy, is entirely isolated away from the rest of this, and there's no way you can have a conversation in Washington about whether another dollar for missile defense may be potentially better spent going to a public health service to detect smallpox that may be a result of a bioterror incident, so you can isolate the population quickly, get them vaccinated, and get them back on life. That conversation can't happen because national security has been bridged off from Homeland Security. So one of the biggest disconnects here is just simply allocation of resources. But there's another real problem. Think about this. For every nation in the planet, national security is designed to do two things. First, protect the nation. And second, if there's any power left over, to protect one's interests beyond one's shores. That's every nation but the United States. National security only does that second thing. We have lived in this wonderful country where we had big bands of water on the left and the right, friendly neighbors to the north and south, and national security was always a water's edge out thing. You did it over there on the soils of our adversaries or our allies. I learned this firsthand as a patrol boat skipper in Norfolk, Virginia, which is the home of the biggest Navy base in the world, when in April 1985, I was called on short order to a meeting at the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet's office as a lieutenant junior grade. That's the second lowest guy in the food chain, with a bunch of room full of very gray-haired captains and commanders, because their naval intelligence sources had received word that there may be a terrorist threat directed against the USS Yorktown that had been involved in the Gulf of Sidra Gaddafi Libya event in that year. They launched the first hardware into Gaddafi's home. And that they may attack the Yorktown on its return into Lower Chesapeake Bay or inside the operating base itself. I'm going, this is kind of an interesting meeting. I wonder why I'm here. And I found out very quickly when the Chief of Staff said, okay, Lieutenant, what is the Coast Guard going to do to protect the Navy? Because that's not our job. And I was going, well, I was thinking, having flashbacks at the time here. I had two 50 caliber machine guns, but unfortunately we were in a little bit of budget constraint. We were under what was called a bullet moratorium. The bullet moratorium was if I shot any of my guns in training, they would have none to replace them if I needed them if somebody shot at me. So not only have my guns never been fought in peace to anger, they've never been fought with at all. I'm thinking that this is probably a skill set that I haven't really well developed right now here, and protecting the Yorktown may not be the best fit. I highlight the story as really a case of the Navy not only didn't think of itself as protecting the United States, it didn't even protect its own assets when it was in its own water. It wasn't part of its mission. And the same thing is true of the rest of our services. They're geared to be water's edge out. And we have, not surprisingly, Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who's not a new guy around town, immediately figures out when the Department of Homeland Security is created and looks at their budget, which is not much, issues an edict in the department. He says that that department wants anything. They want a helicopter ride. They want an analyst. I will personally have to sign on this release, because I'll be darned if the Department of Homeland Security is run on my national security resources. Real men do national security. The thinking here is that national security, separate from protection here, has skewed all the resources and all the attention around the traditional problem set. Validating this last election with the president again and again reminding us we do it over there, so we don't have to do it here. We take the battle to the enemy. And we now have a one-front war, the over there. Now, the other disconnect with this goes back to my thesis about the networks that underpin our power are global. Homeland Security is a bit like hiring a network security manager who says, I'm just going to protect the server next to my desk. It's too complicated to go out there and find all those other computers tethered into the system. It's uncomfortable. I have to get out of my chair. I'll have to figure this out. I'll just protect one right here. We have infrastructure that's critical, but it's a node, maybe a mother node in some cases, to global networks. We have to manage this problem not in a domestic context, but as an international context. That would presumably require the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Commerce, and even in some cases the Department of Defense, were actively engaged on how one would do the security in the international sphere. But they're not, because this problem is a homeland security problem. Of course, one of the reasons why we're having so difficult of a time saying that this is something we might want to do is because we really have the sense that maybe it's just too hard. We're an open society. This infrastructure, as I described, it's been built over the last 20 years without any security. How do we do it now? Given the urgency of the threat, doesn't it make sense to do whatever you can to take the bad guys out? This is seductive logic. My concern is, as somebody who's been well grounded in the world of our military as well as our intelligence community, is that the best defense is a good offense requires on two critical things that the United States simply does not possess and will not possess for 10 to 15 years. The first is intelligence about who they are, where they are, and what they're up to. The 9/11 Commission has documented just how broken our intelligence services are, but the fix is 10 to 15 years in the making. This isn't throwing a switch. It isn't throwing money at it here, developing language skills, developing human agents. It takes a minimum for a CIA agent to be trained 6 years. And our current sort of pro, we want to be pretty good at it when they go out and do these things. And the total number we have is less than the number of FBI agents assigned to the New York district for the world. Just under 1,500. It's in the open record now. For 1,500 spies for the whole world. For an alqaeda threat that has gone from an organization to a movement. The current estimates are there are at least 18 imitator organizations operating in at least 30 countries, where we had a core of a few hundred, now in the low tens of thousands. And I'm not sure how you take the battle to the enemy when they're in Madrid. How does that work? Or how do you take them out when they're in Liverpool? Or when they're in Toronto? Or when they're in Detroit? So, as a practical matter, if essentially hunting and destroying terrorists requires that you have the intelligence to know where they're at and what they're up to, and that our protection response is an alert-based system, the mantra in the Department of Homeland Security is we have a threat-based, risk-managed approach to protecting the homeland. And we've seen that with our colors, right? What we're supposed to have is information that says there's a threat, so everybody start rationing up security and protection. It is premised on the notion that we have intelligence that could guide that effort, which doesn't exist. We get the very best of it in August, when Tom Ridge raised the alert level again just before the election. It was, we have 3-year-old information that these guys might go after the financial assets, maybe in Washington, maybe in New York. Go to Orange. Well, what do you do with that? And it's not that, I mean, that's the best we got, so you share it. But the idea that we can wait to be alerted to make investments and then get back on with life is something that I think is fundamentally flawed, given what we know to be the case. The intelligence doesn't exist. And the military we have was not designed to be an effective counterterrorism force. It was designed to take over states and hold territory. And it's pretty good at that. Not making them work, but holding the territory. It'll take a long time to get there. So that would leave us, presumably, with maybe the opening possibility that the best defense might, in fact, be a pretty good defense. If the offense can't be reliable anytime soon, how do we think about defense in this context? I would argue that what we need to do is rethink what, of course, defense means in this context. It's not about turning ourselves into a nation of moats and castles. It's not about taking away all the civil liberties and turning ourselves into a police state. It's about making prudent investments in protecting the things that are vulnerable and valuable. We have an analogy for this approach, this kind of challenge. It's called safety. 100 years ago, if you went to the robber barons and said, you got to worry about safety, product safety, workplace safety, spilling stuff all over the environment, and you got to do things in the way you do your business that takes those public goods into account. There was a lot of pushback. I can't do that. You put me out of business. There's costs associated with making myself safe. And I've got to compete with other people who aren't doing them. And besides that, who are you to tell me this is my private property? This is an individual liberty issue here. I shouldn't be told how I have to treat my workers or maintain my property. What happened is we said, look, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the negative externalities of your individual behavior is such that we need to find a way to safeguard the public goods while at the same time we manage your entrepreneurial spirit for the profit it accrues. And we found mechanisms that took some time that basically made safety an integrated part of the way in which we design buildings, the way in which we design products, and the way in which we go about our lives. What is safety all about? It's not about eliminating risk. Safety is never an end unto itself. If you want to be perfectly safe in driving, you won't get into a car. Right? I mean, best way to solve the automobile safety problem is to take everybody's car away from them. There's something inherently dangerous about getting into a multi-ton object and hurling at high speeds surrounded by perfect strangers. We have some testimony to this fact. By last year, about 3,000 of us died in automobile-related accidents. Do we throw up our hands and say, hey, potentially you can get killed in a car, so why try? I'll just either drive wherever I want or not. No, what we've done is a number of things. We try to design roads reasonably well that the odds of cars hitting one another will be reduced. We try to affect the behaviors of people who drive by essentially setting some rules on how you get a license, requiring you to have insurance, and to get a low insurance premium, you got to drive better than people who, if you don't want to drive better, you get a very high insurance premium. We try to do incentives here. If you're driving drunk, you can raise real problems. And then if you get in trouble and you get into an accident, we make your risk of surviving pretty good because we designed the car pretty well. And even the worst case scenario, you really get hurt, we build a trauma kind of capability to get you in a hurry, to get you to help so you won't die. Is that free? Are we a bankrupt society because we invested in doing that? The last time I checked, we were the most prosperous society in the world, and it's one that people want to live and work in. Not because safety was in the way. It's because safety was built in and integrated in how we approach life. What is that about? It's about looking at, when you're thinking about safety, you're saying, what if an act of God? What if human error? What if mechanical error compromised a system that I have designed, that I depend upon? And then you run that scenario out and you say, based on its value, I should invest in some safeguards to preclude that possibility within acceptable parameters. Security is simply about asking an additional question. What if somebody with malicious intent targeted the system? Do we protect everything equally? No, you protect the things that are most valuable to you more. Valuable being potentially a lot of dead people if it goes wrong, or real cost to our economy if it's compromised. That's how you prioritize. Do you expect perfect security? No. You build enough in to create some deterrent, and at the same time, if something goes wrong, you manage the response. How does that work? It works by beginning to look at this infrastructure through a different lens, malicious intent being one. If I design this building and I think about the bioterror threat, I will make the ventilation not push out, but suck in and push the air out. That way, if something gets in, I don't spread it around everybody who's here, so they go spread around everybody else. I think about it a little bit differently. If I'm thinking about the way in which I would respond to a hazardous material spill, the mechanism is to put a big sign that says hazardous material here, so if a fireman bumped into it, they would know, ooh, better stay away. That may say from a safety standpoint, but from a security standpoint, that says hit me. So you do things differently. Maybe if we had information about the hazardous shipment provided directly to the fire department, so they know what shipments were coming in, they would both know what they're up against if something goes wrong and be able to do it in a way that we don't say hit me at the same time. Is this impossible? Is it not likely that this country, with the scientific ingenuity it has, with the citizenry and the patriotism it has, that we can't find ways in which we can protect things that make the most attractive targets for people on intent harm on us? I argue it's not. But it can't be done by a national security state that exists under a cone of silence that says we'll take care of you with traditional means while you do your primary job, which is to shop and travel. Every time we raise the alert level, what is your job to do? Shop and travel. We get it under control, behave normal, shop and travel. The problem here is that we're not being engaged like we were in the Second World War, recognizing that this is a new threat, a new problem, where we're the primary targets, the thing we own and value, where we have the expertise and the citizenry that may not exist in the government, and that we need to be a part of the solution as a collective, not dependent upon a paternalistic view that we can be secured away from our shores and go about our lives unimpeded by this new threat. It's a fundamental leadership challenge to convince us that we do not have to essentially just pursue happiness, that we can be a part of the enterprise. The same enterprise that our uniformed men and women are giving their lives off every single day to protect us from this threat. There should be some sense in this country of shared sacrifice. And there is not. And that's a failure for our having a solution to this problem. And I think it's a travesty for the folks who happen to bear the burden here at the end of the day. I would argue here that we can rethink this. One of my basic premises is there's strength not only being able to deliver a punch, but being able to take a punch. That there is deterrence value in resiliency as a society. Go back to my Second World War analogy, not of the Phoney War, but a different one, the Battle of Britain. V-bombs coming into the city of London in utter darkness. Pretty terrifying stuff. Did the British throw up their hands in the air and say, I surrender? Now, what they did is they mobilized to deal with this threat, and in fact, rallied the people to manage the ongoing onslaught of weapons, local fire brigades, collective efforts to get through it. Over time, the Germans figured out there was no military value to carrying on these campaigns. You couldn't hit anything of value, and you actually weren't weakening the will of the people, you were solidifying the will. The British experienced in the IRA. Initially, there was the search and destroy. Over time, it was build resilience in our own society, try to address the underlying issues, and manage the threat on an ongoing basis. Britain in 1982 had 240 terrorist attacks on the British Isles. They didn't stop and turn themselves out, close their borders down, so forth here. And it was the resilience over time that made the issue of the utility of terrorism start to erode. I can't eliminate the threat loony factor, that people are nuts who want to blow things up like the Statue of Liberty or go after the President of the United States. But what we can do is diminish the utility of catastrophic terrorism as a means of warfare. It'll be attractive as long as there's a certainty that a small investment in these horrific acts equals a very big bang for your buck. But if, as in fact, that when these attacks happen, they're like local disasters, like an earthquake, they're like a nor'easter, they're like other things that we manage in our day-to-day lives, no military value, no impact on U.S. power, you have to rethink the military utility of engaging this. Why? Because there's also retribution. I'm not eliminating the offense. In fact, when you do something horrific, the international community tends to rally around you because they see it as an attack on our basic civility, of which we all have to work together, much like we saw immediately aftermath of 9/11. And when you carry out an attack, it's not like these folks have unlimited resources. When they carry out an attack, they leave breadcrumbs. And you can roll up their networks pretty quickly when they attack. That's what happened after Madrid. We didn't know these folks were there. Within 96 hours, we pretty well cleaned up the whole network. If you're thinking about taking 3 years to put a cell together to carry out an attack, and the odds are you're not going to be successful, or you have to attack something low-lying fruit, which your work's going to be undone, you start to have to work harder at it. Even if you say, I'm committed to doing it in any event, by making yourself more resilient, terrorists need to do 4 things that help on the intelligence side. They need more money. They need more expertise. They need to do more staking out and practicing. And they typically need more redundancy in recruits. All that gives smoke signals off that allow your local law enforcement, your intelligence network to see something going on. But if you say it's all so hopeless, we're an open society, we can't possibly begin to do this, then you're allowing virtually anybody to come in willy-nilly style and attack. The most limited time you have to deal with a terrorist is in the execution stage. You're just playing lucky there. It's a new world we're in. We need to fundamentally assess what the threat is. We need to assess our vulnerability. And we have to assess how we have organized ourselves as a society to deal with the fact that there are people out there intent on causing us great harm. We have to see this as not a purely American activity, a domestic activity, but something that has to be managed in a global context. It requires, at the end of the day, real leadership to transform our thinking and transform the willingness we have to allocate our precious resources, in some cases our lives, in this new direction. And what I am most appalled at in this election of 2004 is that neither candidate carried on the conversation that I just tried to present to you here today. But we can get there. And I think what it takes is not relying on Washington. Probably why I'm so committed to be on the road here and to have the chance to interact with all of you and the co-peers. My conviction is that we are a democracy, that ultimately our government responds to the will of the people. And if the people say, what's going on here? Are we making the best choices? How can I help? That at the end of the day, we can get to where we need to go. I look at the explicit event of 9/11, and I recall the fact that somebody who was in New York that day, as somebody who spent the 10 years, certainly the 5 years preceding that time, talking about the al-Qaeda threat and the risk to ourselves as a society, and very specifically the transportation system. It was a nightmare for me, and we shared all together, seeing that loss of life. But it was also a nightmare for me for the lost opportunity being not taken in advance to deal with that threat. But a source of inspiration for me, as I suspect it was for the rest of you, was how people in that city reacted that day. There was no federal government in sight. There were no armed forces anywhere. I didn't see Americans panicked and spooked. I saw the very best of the American people that day. It isn't that there isn't resiliency in the society. It isn't that we have to be protected and treated like children. I think we need is the facts of what's going on, what the risks are, and I think we need to be invited into the conversation. And if we do that, I think we're going to come out as a stronger society and a more prosperous society at the end of the day. Thank you very much. I know I chewed up a lot of the time, but if there are questions, and I know many of you have to leave, but I'm happy to take some questions, and even if the bell goes as well. But if you have to run for the door. Anybody have any questions that I can take on? Yes?
You mentioned with the IRA of Britain addressing the underlying issues. Do you think the U.S. has done any of that, or what would you see as the future of that for the U.S.?
We clearly have not done a sufficient amount. I mean, most of my colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations spend most of the time debating that. How do you get the source issues that lead to that? Clearly, the President thinks he's on that track with his goal of democratizing the Middle East. You know, that will hopefully lead to that end. You know, for me, it's a sort of quirky thing. I talk about sometimes very complicated issues like how you deal with the bioterror threat or containers or chemical industry and so forth. And the response I get from my foreign policy national security elites is this kind of like, that seems all very complicated. It seems very expensive. It seems like it'll take much more time. I just had one of these at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting in January. And my quick back was, oh, democratizing the Middle East. Oh, there's an easy one. And cheap, too. You know? It's, you know, where comfort level is thinking about talking about managing states and democratizing and mobilizing armies and doing stuff. The stuff that I talk about that we need to do is not particularly sexy. It's highly technical. And, you know, it's just, So the answer is there is some sense that there is there, but clearly much more needs to be done. As a practical person, you know, talking about this theory in the next 10 years threat, where I very much worry it's a clear and present problem, and that our overreaction will happen if we're unprepared. That's what I very much worry about, not what the terrorists can do to us per se, what we can do to ourselves. As I look at that, we're not going to win over the hearts and minds of the current groups in the next 10 years. It's something, do we be working overtime to deal with it? Yeah, absolutely. But we're not going to win them over right now. So they say, stop doing all this stuff, let's win over hearts and minds, and we got to have a little more maturity about this. So you got to deal with it at multi-levels. Yes?
Is it your sense?
It worked, yep.
Is it your sense then that creating the Department of Homeland Security was a structural mistake? That was the wrong institutional response?
Well, and I was involved with that with the Hart Rubman Commission here. There was part of it, there's parts yes and parts no. The original proposal that we had developed in the Hart Rubman Commission pre-9/11, this was a commission, by the way, made up of people like the 9/11 style, very lofty group of people, were given a charter by Congress in 1999 to do a 3-year assessment, 1998 rather, a 3-year assessment of our national security environment and recommendations for whoever be the next president. And there were some people like Newt Gingrich and James Schlesinger and Senator Rubman and Senator Hart and Admiral Harry Train and John Galvin. These were kind of who's who types. They said that the #1 national security challenge for the United States would be a catastrophic terrorist attack on our soil, and we're not organized to deal with it. They rolled that out on January 31st, 2001. Not a single major media news outlet showed up to report on it. It was something the Congress spent a lot of money on, by the way. And the administration said, we're going to do our own thinking. Thanks, we'll get to you. That didn't happen until their new thinking guy showed up on September 10th, 2001 to put the study together. All right, now, the department issue was about the border agencies. You couldn't have a more dysfunctional system than we had pre-9/11. The Customs Service was in the Treasury Department, the Coast Guard was in the Department of Transportation, INS was in Justice, they were all orphans in the parent departments, they weren't getting much care and feeding, they didn't talk to each other, this was about as broken as it could get. So the notion of saying, let's get them under one roof where somebody could advocate for them and figure out how they can connect dots, that seemed to be pretty straightforward. It should be done. They ended up throwing 22 agencies in the hopper, breaking some up into pieces, and then making sure they gave no resources to actually staff the Secretariat. I mean, how bad? The Chief Operating Officer, Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who's charged with the biggest merger and acquisition in human history, has 5 people working for him. There is 1 senior executive servant, civil servant working for the entire Secretariat. Everybody else has been a political appointee, virtually all who have left since the election. And detailees from the existing departments, whose job is to go into the department and make sure their agency's turf isn't mismanaged. So there are problems with the department, but there are problems with the department that were almost made it set up to fail. But the issue of a department separate from national security, I would argue that. A more structural problem was creating a Homeland Security Council separate from a National Security Council. There should have been a National Security Council that deals with these issues under it. So that's pretty much where I go with that. Yes, up here?
Sir, I just wanted to say it was very interesting to listen to you. I guess my question more had to do with what kind of comes after. You mentioned that every time you speak of these things to people, they get kind of scared and they, you know, how do we do this? Where do we get the ideas for this? Where do we get the technology and the money to start to protect ourselves here, our ports and our cities and things like that? Where would that expertise come from? Is that something that would happen with the Department of Homeland Security? I mean, how do they come up with the ideas and the technology to start protecting us here rather than going abroad?
Great question. The prescription I end up putting out here as a model to think about it, well, one is it's got to come, for critical infrastructure, it almost has to come entirely from the private sector. Our critical infrastructure is 85% privately owned. And so the designers, the operators, and the owners of it are there. And many of these sectors are very loosely regulated. So there's very few people in government who understand how they work. If there's not a regulation, nobody has to know in the government how they work to oversee them. And so there's not much expertise. The national security community, of course, hasn't paid attention to these networks as an issue. So there's not much expertise there. So you're really asking the people who own and operate and design these things, okay, let's figure out how we can identify where the vulnerabilities are by just putting yourself in the shoes. Somebody who's going to be, with malicious intent, target what you've done. How would you fix it? All right, now what we have to do, though, is a couple of things to structure that. The President has said in his Homeland Security strategy, which is different from the national security strategy, that there is, quote, sufficient market incentive for the private sector to protect itself, that the job of the federal government is national defense and border protection. Well, it turns out the data that I've got from talking with a number of CEOs of these large companies, of these infrastructures, as well as the research and so forth here, is that there is no market incentive for the private sector to protect itself. It has two problems. It's a tragedy of the commons problem. There's a free rider problem. If security has some cost, I don't own the whole infrastructure. If I basically decide to protect this one piece of it because it's in my purview and my neighbors don't, I raise my cost, which undermines my profitability, or I try to pass it on to my customers, which scares them away. My neighbors essentially are the place that these guys will figure out where the weakness is, and the whole sector, because it's critical, will be affected. Then Congress will come in after the fact with solutions that will look nothing like what I invested up front, and this doesn't make any sense to do on my own. Now, the other problem is a liability issue. Security is always about a decision about how much security is enough. So if I'm a company, or do it through a trade association, less chemical companies come together, as they said they were going to do, and we'll identify government. You don't need to talk to about security. We know security best. We'll take care of ourselves. Stay out of our face. We'll come together and agree minimum requirements for security for all our members. There's two core problems with them being able to do that. One is they don't have the understanding of the threat to assess how much security is enough, because that's all in government's hands. So how do you decide, yeah, I think it's good, when you don't know the underlying intelligence that says what they're up to or not? Of course, it's not very good, so that's not going to help them much either, but that's a problem for them. But the real issue is a liability issue. We agree as a trade association that this is a sufficient bar of security. Everybody abide by this. You have an incident. By definition, you raised the bar was too low. Now we're going to hold you to account as a public because you were more interested in the bottom line than you were in protecting yourselves and the rest of us. The way you solve the liability issue, you've got to give them a good Samaritan protection. The government has to be part of the conversation that says, yeah, this is agreed upon standard. If you do that, you're good to go. We'll take the heat if the threat is above and beyond that threshold. We also will make sure the free riders don't get away with free riding by essentially having checks and balances in the system so that people aren't putting the whole thing vulnerable. It takes a private-public cooperation. The framework I propose for doing this is not a Department of Homeland Security, but it's something that I borrowed from the finance sector. I call it the Federal Reserve System, a security reserve system, modeled off the Fed, because I see the problem as being very analogous. The robber barons in the late 19th century had this problem. The banking system wasn't working for the economy and how it was working. But they didn't want to let the federal government run a bank. There were two reasons. There wasn't anybody competent to do it, because we hadn't had one since Andy Jackson got rid of the Second National Bank. The second problem was they would politicize it. So in classic American style, we're a nation of great ideologues, but when we really deal with great problems, we always do convenient workarounds that don't fit ideologically nicely. So these great business, free enterprise guys say, we'll have a central bank, but it'll report to Congress, not to the president, the executive branch. We'll self-fund it, and we'll make it as incestuous as heck. We'll put all our people in it who know banking, and we'll set the standards and make everybody live by them. I suggest a similar model, district-based, around the critical sectors where you bring private people in and you have the public players that provide ongoing continuity, arrive at basic standards for security, for training, for physical controls, for all the other kinds of things that need to be done for your process, for continuity operations and so forth, and that the condition of being in that infrastructure is that you live by this code. And the way to enforce it is not government people and everybody's oversight, it's through insurance. When you get a car, to go to register your car, what do you got to present? Proof of insurance. So if you guys are going to operate a piece of critical infrastructure, you have to be, I argue, have a certificate of security responsibility. Insurance that if something goes wrong on your piece of real estate, that in fact you can put something in the kitty. But we cap the liability. So that way the market can support this. If you basically do due diligence, not gross negligence, and you live by this, your liability is capped. Then we create a catastrophic terrorism fund that the federal government owns based around fees of the system up to about $100 billion. That if basically we have to pay out to fix something is there, we could draw on. Now the real enforcement tool is the insurers, before they write paper, go out and make sure you live up by these requirements. Otherwise you can't get the insurance, which you can't operate in. Then you have oversight of the insurers by government and an auditing function, and if it turns out people are giving away paper without doing due diligence, you downgrade the insurer as a high risk, which makes people run away from them. In other words, there are market incentives that we have to deal with this kind of problem, which we've applied in other sectors. What I just described about a catastrophic terrorism fund was exactly what we did after the Exxon VLDs grounded in 1990 in Prince William Sound. It's called the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. It had the same elements to it here. In this case, we had an oil spill that cost $3.5 billion to clean up. Now, happily, it was Exxon, which has deep pockets and is a U.S. player, because the Coast Guard had a total of $15 million in its cleanup fund. That wouldn't have gone very far. They got the first ducks out of the water, basically. Right. So Congress suddenly realized, what if this was a foreign ship that came in, who disappeared, its ownership disappeared overnight? Who would pick up the tab? Ooh, that would be pretty messy. So what they came up with was to say, all right, every single ship that comes into U.S. water, oil tanker, has to have a certificate of financial responsibility, proof on record with the Coast Guard that if something goes wrong, you can put money in the kitty, $1,500 per metric ton of the size of the ship, to pay for the oil spill cleanup. Then they created an oil pollution trust fund built around a nickel a barrel tax of domestic production and foreign importation to get to $1 billion, that basically sat there as an available series of resources. And then the tax went idle. If they had to draw it on the account, the tax would automatically kick in to refill it. We had in the 1980s averaged 77,000 barrels of oil per year dropped in U.S. waters. Post-Oil Pollution Act of 1980, we've been spilling 4,000 barrels of oil. Most of it, by the way, by the U.S. Navy, who's not bound by this. The change is not that there aren't unsafe ships out there. It's just that none of them come in U.S. waters anymore. They can't get insurance unless somebody goes down there and verifies they're living up to the international code. And the Coast Guard's enforcement was to go out and inspect the ships periodically. And if it turned out not only that they weren't satisfactory, they dinged everybody who had the classification society who said they were good to go. And they basically said any ship who has that inspector is going to wait offshore till we check out to make sure you're really safe. And time is money. And boy, do they scramble to get somebody good who could come in. And so you create incentives to raise the bar. Right. This is complicated, clearly, but it's doable. It would take us having a national conversation that got out of the simplistic notions that the problem with government is government, that the best way to deal with terror is wars over there. This bumper sticker kind of mentality is something that, in fact, isn't true to our tradition as Americans when faced with complex problems. The pragmatism that has really been our greatest national asset seems to be in short supply these days. I'm convinced we can still harness it in time to deal with the threat. Yes, sir.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but one of the things I found both intriguing and troubling about what you've had to say today is that you don't offer much of a window where we can begin to address the resolution of terrorists cropping up before they become terrorists. What is it that we ought to be doing to create an environment where that sort of an attitude, that sort of a mindset doesn't seem to flourish?
Yeah, and I don't mean to distract here. As I'm saying, I've got this sort of pragmatic middle message for the next 10 years. This is something we'll be dealing with, and I particularly put in contrast the money and resources we're spending on traditional national security and suggesting this is very fuzzy thinking. But I'm not saying that this is the exclusive way in which one handles a war on terror. What clearly is another lost opportunity right after 9/11 was a sudden realization by most Americans that we're tied to a world, a big world beyond our shores, and that there are people out there who don't like us, and that they don't like us for reasons that, well, difficult for many times for us to understand, we can comprehend, and that there are probably ways in which those can be addressed if we want to make reasonable investments in doing this and working with other players to deal with that here. But that fell off the truck as well with the best defense is a good offense taking the battle to the enemy. We do some of that on the margins, but we don't do much of it here. You know, it's hard. It was a lot easier for me to make the argument that I was trying to make in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 about recalibrating national security to where we are, because we were at a time of surplus. We hadn't ensnared ourselves in Iraq with no end in sight, with no allies now in sight, and with prospects of, you know, getting out on the low and expensive, so with it being pretty small. We have a finite amount of resources, and making the real investment in these long-term problems is something there doesn't seem to be much political appetite for. But I think the lack of political appetite is in part due because we've been seduced into thinking that traditional use of force mechanisms, sort of the Cold War mentality, deterrence through essentially overwhelming force will be the way in which you keep bad behavior at bay, that we haven't questioned those assumptions enough to really make the recognition that it really is about building this capacity. I would say the good news of most of the things that I talk about for defense on the protection side, the resilience side, is one that's not obviously exclusively an American issue. I spend a lot of my time in developing countries right now on issues of ports and customs and so forth here, and I don't make the case because you need to do this because Americans are under threat and you've got to help us out. It's a hard case to make in Africa, where people are dying by the millions, for something like disease versus, the numbers that we're dealing with here. What I make the case is that for your society to essentially prosper, we've got to have a more rational way in which you can manage your borders so that you can have access to this economy at a minimal cost, that you can track foreign investment, so that we can essentially have the rule of law operate, we can keep guns out of your society. There's lots of things here that we, while now driven more in the paranoid side in the U.S. side perhaps, that we need a capacity, and we have to help you develop the capacity. And some of that skill set, some of its resources. The craziness we have now is sort of the sink or swim approach. Developing countries, here are the new requirements for security of ports, live by it or you're not going to trade with us. All right, let's say we enforce that for every developing country in the world. What do they become? Failed states. That's the threat we're trying to protect ourselves from. Why aren't we working with the World Bank? Why aren't we working with the regional banks? Why aren't we making a real concerted effort to say, let's build the capacity in these places to essentially be a part of the economy for the rule of law to prosper and to deal with real threats as they meet, not just a terror threat. What a difference would it make in our tone if instead of saying, you around the world need to help us, there's this issue of terrorists and this bioterror is a very scary thing, is we said, there's a problem that we have in this world, it's called pathogens that know no borders. And it looks like things like avionic flu, and it looks like SARS, and it looks like a whole bunch of other stuff that are quite frightening for all of us as humanity. What if we work with you to help improve the public health capacity to detect disease early and to be able to respond to it effectively so that we aren't increasingly all affected by it? And then for our own right, who doesn't like this kind of thing, you say, this is bioterror. Because it's the same capacity you need. But instead we do just the opposite. This money can only be used for bioterror. And we can't do this other godforsaken thing of protecting people from disease, because that would be wasteful resources. Our whole tone. I argue if you rely solely on the offense, you'll take America's values and push them to the breaking point and beyond. Offense requires the use of force and intelligence. If intelligence being critical, you'll do whatever it takes to get the intelligence, even as redefining torture under the Geneva Convention. Because you think it's hopeless to protect us, it's so expensive, so costly, you've got to do whatever it takes. You round people up, you send them to Guantanamo Bay, you don't let them out. You do extraordinary rendition, picking people up who you don't know much about and sending them to places that might torture them. Because, hey, this could protect American lives. And you don't put together coalitions of the willing when you know somebody's coming at you, you act. But the defense, making ourselves resilient, building public health systems, building food safety systems, building the wherewithal to make containers secure against other problems here, are things, in fact, that have consistent with our values. They're about protecting networks we all depend upon and making them more safe. And that is an argument, and I would also argue, that gives you breathing room so you don't have to go to excess on the intelligence, on the use of force. Because you know as a society you can take a blow. And so just the opposite, not only is there deterrent value in my argument here in building these resilience, building these defenses, but they're also in almost all instances consistent with our values. Because it's about taking what is most valuable and protecting it in smart, intelligent ways, not dumb ways, smart, intelligent ways. Question here.
Yes, I kind of had a follow-up question for that. You noted earlier that the United States faces an increasingly asymmetric enemy. What would be your recommendation as far as United States grand strategy in dealing with that?
Well, I guess you're sort of hearing overall, I'm not in this either war camp. I'm not saying stop doing, our military is obsolete, go away. If you have intelligence, these are some very nasty folks. You're not going to win over their hearts and minds. It's helpful to have some means. It's also very useful to be able to do this with cooperation. The most important, given that we have under 1,500 human spies, there are, in fact, other intelligence services out there. It'd be nice to get their cooperation. You get that by basically being seen as their allies versus being seen as their adversaries. So one of the things that you really need to do is you really have to recognize that the intelligence problem is going to require a lot more collaborative activity than unilateral activity. And as just as a practical matter, there's limits to U.S. power. It's nice to go it alone, but for this problem set, you can't go it alone, so you better have a stiff upper lip, put up with some of the aggravation of working with others, and get on with it, because that's central to the enterprise. Clearly, there's the issue of these, my focus is on critical infrastructure, because I think that's where you have the biggest bang for your buck. And so I think it's really about building the structure to make those systems more resilient. I use the term resilient because I'm not saying perfectly secure. Be able to take an attack and be able to isolate it and get the system restored and up and running, which is, again, a lot more collaboration with private sector players who are involved, not just domestic ones. In the case of maritime security, to sort of highlight the complexity of the problem, a quick sea story, it was in Singapore this last September, and I was invited out there by PSA International, who runs Singapore's port and also a number of ports around the world. And they had this International Board of Advisors, which were essentially their customers. These are the CEOs of the 12 largest ocean container lines in the world. And they're having a day-and-a-half-a-year meeting, and they asked me to come in and talk about security with them on the first morning. And I was struck by two things. One, they wanted to talk about security. The second was, when I got in the room and the door was closed, I looked around and I was the only American in the room. This is an infrastructure that's 98% foreign-owned, privately owned. We only own 2% of the container fleet in the world, and that's the service runs to Hawaii and to Puerto Rico. The other 90% is these folks overseas. Now, you're not going to make a case to them by pushing their patriotic heartstrings. You better find some other incentives here for them to want to participate in the process, and those we spent some time talking about. But so you have to reach out to a different cast of characters. This infrastructure is privately owned, globally owned. And how are we organized to deal with that? We're not. So I don't think I've satisfied the requirements for grand strategy there in response here, but I hope we gave you some indication where I'd be heading in that, different from where we are. Oh, way back here.
Yeah. I was wondering about the urgency of the threat, because you mentioned that a couple times, and to listen to the administration talk, there are terrorists chomping at the bit to kill Americans in America, and at the same time, you have the media, and I think it was Tommy Thompson on his way out. He said, "I'm surprised there hasn't been an attack. We are so pitifully protected," and yet there haven't been any attacks. And at the same time, if you look at terrorism, say from 1990 onward, we're talking about an average of 100, 150, 200 lives a year. And so, it's not a big thing like 30,000 people a year dying in cars. So, how do you assess the actual urgency of the threat? Not, for instance, politicizing the urgency of the threat, but like, what is the real urgency? And secondly, given that urgency, what costs are really worth it to deal with it?
Really great question, and certainly one we haven't heard much enough discussion about. Part of the problem is, again, this deficit of intelligence makes anybody hard to be definitive to say, here's a threat, this is what they're up to, this is what we're likely to face. I would certainly make the case there has not been an attack on American soil, but there's obviously been a number, in fact, increased incidents of attacks elsewhere in Western society since 9/11. Obviously, Madrid being the most dramatic, but a very closely foiled one in the UK involving chemical agents. A similar one in Jordan involving a chemical facility that was being targeted. There was one in Ashdod in the port of Israel that was directed against chemical facility on the port as an infrastructure issue. Of course, there were attacks on the hotels in Indonesia. There was attack on banks in Turkey and so forth here. So, for me, one of the real hard problems with pre-9/11 was people were saying there was no attacks. And I would point to World Trade Center 1, I point to the USS Yorktown, I point to our embassies, and I'm seeing some, trajectories here that suggest that there is, in fact, an increased organized capacity to carry out more and more sophisticated attacks that actually have some impact on us. Why hasn't there been an attack in the U.S.? That's really the question, that deserves to be answered for somebody like me who's making a case that we need to do more about this. Maybe, in fact, the president's being successful. He's deterring these things. The consensus view seems to be amongst folks that are the real experts on the al-Qaeda groups and so forth, and their imitators. And I tend to be more of I'm the catcher's mitt guy versus the pitch. Right? There are people out there who really know the terrorists and really know what they're up to. I think about the world and what they like the attack, why is that vulnerable, and what you could do about it to make it less vulnerable. But the school of thought basically is there are four things that are constraining the attack. The first was that the early action against Afghanistan disrupted the senior leadership. The kind of sophisticated attacks I'm worried about take some folks with some gray matter, and typically they're at the top of your organization. They were essentially severed from the ground troops with the attack on Afghanistan. That bought us time, about 18 months. The second piece of this, the troops themselves were trained to do car bombs and truck bombs and sort of low-end thing, and that's what they ended up doing largely after 9/11, was just replaying what they were trained to do. So the underlying infrastructure for these more sophisticated attacks hadn't, is still sort of work in progress. The third is it takes some time to build a cell and have presence. And the reason why you take time, one looks around and says there's so many easy targets. We all can walk through airports, we'll walk through any city or a school like this and say, geez, I could hit this and that, be a lot of dead people and so forth. Why haven't they done it? Well, it goes back to the point I was making. When you carry out a terrorist attack, you expose your organization. And so you put what could take years of work building your cell and infrastructure at risk by doing something willy-nilly. So the fact that you're going to husband this resource to do something big seems to be what their driver is, particularly since then that's really the last thing Osama has made clear, that he wants to do something big. He wants to outdo the last thing. And I think imitators have a sort of point, yeah, we'll try to outdo it too. We're not going to waste it on the U.S. doing willy-nilly stuff. We're going to do something big. And the big seems to be, from the intelligence we have gathered from them, big involves weapon of mass destruction. Nuclear weapon, biological weapon. That's not IRA style. That's not Palestinian style. That's tens of thousands of people. Loss of life, loss of urban centers of real importance. So I would say the urgency is there. We can't afford not to make the urgency. And I guess the good news I'm trying to make on the good side of the things that I try to advocate for is the things that I'm most for have dual benefits beyond security, beyond counterterrorism. In fact, I even go further and argue in my book here that the only security measures that are sustainable are those that do have a dual benefit. If it's just about security, they always have a problem of complacency kicking in and a skillful adversary figuring out which is a security measure and then running it. So the only security measures that I endorse as a security expert is something that has a market value or another public good value that keeps people vested in it, like public health. I mean, the biggest threat we should be facing today, the thing I'm most worried about, despite my presentation today, is not terrorism, it's avionic flu. It's a 70% mortality rate. And we know how it works. We know flu pandemics, we've had histories of this. And we know that while we have some better tools to understand it more today, controlling it is much worse because we all get on airplanes and our global ecology is essentially classed together. This is a thing that will clearly affect tens of millions of lives. And basically even U.S. foreign policy perspective. Let's say we build the vaccine for this. We have enough of it. Obviously we couldn't even get through this flu season doing this, right? But let's see we actually do this here. And we can do what would be the total capacity in the world today, about 300 million doses. And let's say we Americans had 250 million of these doses. And we don't share with anybody. You know, how does that affect our standing in the world? So the issues are that at the end of the day, it's not just the terror issue itself should be our myopic focus and take our blood and our treasure. Terrorism for me, it was a book I was writing right before 9/11 I had to change. Terrorism was a range of transnational problems that reflect a new reality that essentially as we've grown into this global village, there are bad downsides as well as upsides, and that we need new capacities to manage the downsides that transcend the traditional state-centric models. And they range from invasive species, disease control, environmental issues, global warming, and so forth. These are the public policy challenges of our time, and they're global and they're transnational. And we're the world's leader. Shouldn't we put some treasure, some ingenuity, some wherewithal into addressing them? And I hope I've helped make the case that we should.